Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are likely a dedicated learner.
Absolutely.
Maybe you're a medical student furiously prepping for your exams, trying to understand the mathematical foundations of disease tracking.
Or a junior doctor trying to make sense of the dizzying reality of clinical practice.
Right, where the guidelines sometimes seem to just completely contradict your direct patient observations.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
Or perhaps you're a public health trainee looking to master the foundations of epidemiology.
Yeah.
Or, honestly, maybe you're just someone insanely curious about how we measure, track, and ultimately protect human health on a massive global scale.
Whoever you are and wherever you're listening from, we have a very specific mission for you today.
We do. We are exploring two massive interconnected chapters from the Oxford textbook of global public health. Specifically, we're going to look at Chapter 11.4 on population screening and Chapter 5.2 on ecological and multi-level studies.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
It really is. So, to frame this properly, I want you to hold two overarching metaphors in your mind as we work our way through this material. For the first half, when we discuss screening, I want you to think of it as an early warning radar system.
Or what we might call upstream engineering.
Yes. It's the act of actively identifying the microscopic structural cracks in a dam long before the dam actually breaks.
Right.
But for our second topic, ecological and multi-level studies, we're going to completely flip that perspective. Think of it as studying the forest, not just the individual trees.
It's what happens when the context that a person lives in literally becomes the exposure itself.
Okay, let's unpack this.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, public health fundamentally requires systems thinking. You can't just look at a single data point or a single patient in a vacuum. We have to follow a conceptual framework where we move from a risk to an exposure to an outcome, to a specific intervention, and finally, to the overall system impact of that intervention.
That's a whole chain.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at two entirely different ends of this public health spectrum. First, we'll examine how we target interventions at the microscopic individual level within a massive population.
Which is the essence of screening.
Right. And then we're going to pull the camera way, way back to look at how we measure the impact of the macro-level population context itself on the individual.
Which is where ecological studies come in.
Yeah. It requires a shift from thinking about biological mechanisms to thinking about structural mechanisms.
Let's start with the individual level, looking at population screening as outlined in Chapter 11.4. The term screening is ubiquitous in medicine, but the textbook is incredibly pedantic about how it's defined.
It has to be.
Right. It relies on a foundational definition by McEwen from 1968, which states that screening is a medical investigation that does not arise from a patient's request for advice for a specific complaint. That feels like a vital distinction to establish right away.
It is the defining characteristic. In traditional clinical medicine, the patient initiates the interaction. They feel a lump, they have a persistent cough, or they're experiencing unusual fatigue.
You know something's wrong.
Right. They go to a healthcare professional seeking an explanation and a remedy. And because the patient is suffering and seeking help, they implicitly accept the risks associated with diagnostic tests and subsequent treatment.
Sure, you accept the side effects of a biopsy if you're trying to figure out why you're in pain.
Exactly. But screening flips that entire dynamic. In screening, it's the healthcare provider, usually operating on behalf of a national public health system, who initiates the intervention. The system reaches out to individuals who presume themselves to be completely healthy, offering them a test.
I see how that changes the dynamic. If I go to my doctor because I feel terrible, I'm asking for help. But if the government sends me a letter asking me to provide a biological sample when I feel perfectly fine, the government is implying a promise.
A very big promise.
They're implying that taking this test will definitively benefit me.
That is the core of the ethical tension right there. When a public health program invites healthy people to be tested, it carries an implicit guarantee that the process will do more good than harm.
Right.
And mathematically, when you test hundreds of thousands or millions of healthy people, you are guaranteed to cause harm to a certain percentage of them. That's why we must rigidly differentiate true population screening from what clinicians often do in practice, which is called case finding or opportunistic testing.
Let's draw that line clearly. If a general practitioner has a patient with diabetes and systematically checks their retinas every year for diabetic retinopathy or checks their feet for neuropathy, the doctor might casually call that screening for complications.
They probably do call it that.
But according to the textbook, that is not true population screening.
Correct. That is case finding. The person is already a patient. They already have a diagnosed underlying condition that places them at high risk for a specific complication.
The context is totally different.
Exactly. Similarly, if a healthy person walks into a sexual health clinic for contraception, and the nurse asks if they'd also like an HIV test while they're there, that's opportunistic testing. True population screening is systematically applying a test to a defined, broadly healthy population.
Give me an example of that.
A classic example is a national call recall program that sends a letter to every woman between the ages of 50 and 70 inviting them for a mammogram, regardless of their personal medical history.
Understanding that distinction helps explain why the textbook describes screening as a paradox. On the surface, the narrative we're all taught is that catching a disease early is universally good.
It seems so intuitive.
It does.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a cancer growing, you want to find it when it's the size of a pinhead, not when it's the size of a grapefruit. So the immediate assumption is that we should just screen everyone for everything, all the time. But the text treats screening with a profound degree of caution, almost skepticism.
The skepticism is hard won. To understand it, we really need to look at the historical trajectory of screening. The modern enthusiasm began in the 1940s with mass miniature radiography, or MMR, for tuberculosis.
Oh, right. TB was a massive issue back then.
A devastating public health crisis in the mid-20th century. When effective antimicrobial treatments for TB finally became available around 1946, finding the disease early in the population became a massive, tangible victory.
Because it's infectious.
Yes. You could X-ray a crowd, find the early TB, treat it, and stop the chain of transmission. That success created a wave of blind optimism throughout the 1950s and 60s. The medical community basically assumed this model would work perfectly for every chronic disease.
But chronic diseases aren't infectious diseases. Finding a slow-growing cellular abnormality in an organ is fundamentally different than finding a highly contagious bacterium in someone's lung.
Precisely. And that realization forced the World Health Organization to intervene. In 1968, two public health pioneers, Wilson and Jungner, published a landmark paper laying out strict criteria that a disease must meet before a government should ever implement a screening program.
And these are still used today, right?
They are still the bedrock of global public health policy. They stated that the condition must be an important health problem, which seems obvious, but they went much deeper. You must thoroughly understand the natural history of the disease from its latent to its declared stage.
Let's pause on that phrase. Latent to declared stage. What does that mean in practical terms for a pathologist or an epidemiologist?
It means you have to know what the disease actually does if you leave it alone. Many cellular abnormalities look terrifying under a microscope, but will never actually progress to cause symptoms or threaten the patient's life.
So finding it doesn't actually help.
Right. If you don't understand the natural progression, you don't know if finding it early is actually helpful. Furthermore, Wilson and Jungner stated that there must be an effective, acceptable treatment available.
That makes sense.
There is no public health value in screening for a devastating, incurable disease if finding it early doesn't change the outcome. You are just increasing the amount of time the person lives in terror.
Wow, yeah.
Finally, they mandated that you must have a simple, safe, precise, and validated test, and the overall benefit of the program must definitively outweigh the physical and psychological harms.
That brings us to the harms, which the textbook details extensively. We aren't just talking about the physical risk of the test itself, like radiation from an X-ray or a bowel perforation from a colonoscopy.
The harms go way beyond that.
We're talking about the systemic harms, overdiagnosis, overtreatment, false reassurance for those who get a false negative, and immense psychological anxiety for those who get a false positive.
And that anxiety caused by a false positive is often dismissed by clinicians as a temporary inconvenience.
Just a little scare.
Exactly. A patient gets a positive test, they worry for a few weeks, they get a biopsy, it comes back clear, and they're fine. That's the clinical narrative. But large-scale epidemiological studies show that the psychological trauma of being told you might have a lethal disease can persist for years, permanently altering a person's quality of life and their relationship with the healthcare system.
Which leads us directly into the mathematical engine of screening. If we're going to invite millions of healthy people to take a test, the statistical properties of that test dictate whether the program will be a public health triumph or a catastrophic failure. Let's go back to the early warning radar analogy.
Okay.
If I am an engineer building a radar system for a military base, my primary goal is to catch every single incoming hostile missile. I do not want to miss a single one. In screening terminology, that is high sensitivity.
Catching all the true positives.
Right. Sensitivity is the ability of the test to correctly identify all the people who truly have the disease. But simultaneously, I don't want my radar system sounding the alarm, triggering the sirens, and scrambling fighter jets every time a flock of geese flies over the base.
That would be a disaster.
Exactly. And that is high specificity. Specificity is the text's ability to correctly identify the healthy people, the true negatives, and leave them alone.
And this is where public health mathematics becomes deeply counterintuitive for many people, especially clinicians who are trained to focus on the individual patient in front of them.
Why is that?
Well, if a doctor is treating a sick patient, they are terrified of missing a diagnosis. Their worst fear is sending someone home who actually has a life-threatening illness. Therefore, clinicians intuitively value sensitivity above all else. They want a test that catches everything.
That makes sense at the bedside.
Yes. But in population screening, specificity is almost always vastly more important than sensitivity.
I want to push back on that slightly because to a layperson, that sounds dangerous. You're saying it's more important to ignore the geese than to catch every single missile. Why would we accept a test that might miss a few sick people just to avoid inconveniencing some healthy people?
It's not about inconvenience. It's about the sheer mathematical weight of the population. It comes down to disease prevalence.
Okay.
In a general healthy population, the prevalence of the conditions we screen for is usually incredibly low, often well under 1%. When you apply a test to millions of people, the vast, overwhelming majority of them are healthy.
Right.
If your test is highly sensitive, but even slightly lacking in specificity, the sheer volume of healthy people taking the test means your false positives will absolutely swamp your true positives.
Let's actually walk through the math on this because the textbook outlines how positive predictive value, or PPV, shifts based on prevalence, and the numbers are sobering.
They really are.
Let's imagine a mid-sized city of 100,000 people. A biotech company approaches the city council with a shiny new screening test for a specific type of cancer. They present their clinical trial data, which shows the test has 95% sensitivity, meaning it successfully catches 95 out of 100 sick people.
Good so far.
And it also has 95% specificity, meaning it correctly identifies 95 out of 100 healthy people as healthy. To a politician, 95% accuracy sounds like an A-plus test.
It sounds phenomenal until you run it through the reality of the population. Positive predictive value asks the most important question for the patient sitting at home waiting for the mail. If my test result comes back positive, what is the actual mathematical probability that I truly have the disease?
Okay, so let's look at your city of 100,000 people. Let's say the prevalence of this cancer in the general population is 0.1%.
Okay, let's do the math out loud.
If the prevalence is 0.1%, that means out of our 100,000 citizens, only 100 people actually have the cancer. The other 99,900 people are perfectly healthy.
Exactly. Now, let's apply our 95% sensitive test to those 100 sick people. It catches 95 of them. Those are our true positives. Sadly, it misses 5 of them. Those are our false negatives.
Got it.
Now, we apply our 95% specific test to the 99,900 healthy people. It correctly identifies 94,905 of them as healthy. Those are our true negatives. But because it has a 5% error rate on healthy people, it flags 5% of that massive healthy group as sick.
So 5% of 99,900, that's 4,995 people.
Yes. 4,995 healthy people just received a phone call telling them they might have cancer. Those are your false positives. Now, let's calculate the positive predictive value. In total, the testing program generated 5,090 positive results.
That's the 95 real cases plus the 4,995 false alarms.
Exactly. If you are one of the people who received a positive result, your chance of actually having the disease is 95 divided by 5,090.
Which is roughly 1.86%.
Yes.
So if I'm a healthy person and I get a call from my doctor saying this highly advanced 95% accurate screening test came back positive, there's less than a 2% chance I actually have the disease.
That's the reality.
There's a 98% chance I am perfectly fine, but I'm now terrified, and I'm about to be sent for MRIs, biopsies, and specialist consultations.
You have just outlined why specificity is the paramount concern in public health engineering. The false positives wildly outnumber the true positives. This doesn't just create individual anxiety, it creates a structural crisis.
So.
It triggers a massive cascade of expensive, invasive, and potentially harmful follow-up diagnostic procedures on nearly 5,000 perfectly healthy people in your city alone. This overwhelms the radiology departments, it bankrupts the public health budget, and inevitably, a certain percentage of those healthy people will suffer complications from the unnecessary biopsies.
The textbook provides a brilliant real-world application of how epidemiologists manipulate these variables, specifically looking at screening for beta thalassemia. They discuss adjusting the MCH cutoff. Let's unpack MCH. That stands for mean cell hemoglobin, which is essentially a measure of how much hemoglobin is inside a single red blood cell. What does adjusting the cutoff actually achieve?
Well, beta thalassemia is an inherited blood disorder. When screening for carriers of the trait, laboratories look at the MCH level. A lower MCH can indicate carrier status. The text notes that in a high-prevalence population like certain hospital catchments in London, where many patients have demographic origins in regions where the trait is common, using an MCH cutoff of 27 picograms works quite well.
Okay.
In that specific high-prevalence environment, it gave 100% sensitivity and a positive predictive value of about 77.4%. That means if the test flagged you, there is a nearly 80% chance you were actually a carrier. That is highly efficient.
But the dynamic changes entirely if you take that exact same 27 picogram test and deploy it in a low prevalence geographic area like a rural district with totally different demographic origin.
Exactly. Because the prevalence of the trait is so much lower in that new population, the math we just did with your hypothetical city kicks in. The positive predictive value of that exact same 27 picogram cutoff plummets. The text notes it drops to somewhere between 1.3 and 30%. Suddenly, the local clinics are drowning in false alarms, recalling thousands of people who simply have slightly smaller red blood cells for benign reasons, like minor iron deficiency.
So how do the system engineers fix that without designing an entirely new biological test?
They alter the threshold and combine parameters to artificially boost specificity. For example, in screening programs aimed at identifying maternal alpha-0 carriers to prevent a condition called hydrops vitalis, which is a severe, often fatal condition where massive amounts of fluid build up in the tissues and organs of the fetus, researchers needed to reduce the false positive rate.
What did they do?
They found that by simply lowering the MCH cutoff to a stricter 25 picograms, and then crucially combining that blood result with a simple questionnaire about the patient's family geographic origins, they dramatically increased the specificity.
Because they used the demographic data to essentially pre-filter the population, concentrating the prevalence in the tested group.
Precisely. And the real-world impact was staggering. By doing this, they reduced the need to recall the pregnant patient's partner for follow-up genetic testing from 1 in 61 down to just 1 in 1497.
That's a 96% reduction in partner recall.
Think of the impact of that. You save an immense amount of money in laboratory costs. You free up the genetic counselors to focus on the true high-risk cases, and most importantly, you spare nearly 1,500 couples the profound emotional distress of a false alarm during pregnancy.
This highlights the immense administrative and financial machinery behind these programs, which brings us to evaluating the cost and governance of screening. Governments don't have an infinite pool of money. When they decide to screen a national population, they're making a profound economic choice. This is where concepts like opportunity costs come into play. If a health ministry decides to spend $50 million annually screening for a rare condition, this $50 million they cannot spend building new intensive care units or funding addiction treatment centers. The textbook mentions that they evaluate this using metrics like QALYs and dailies. Let's break those acronyms down. Quality adjusted life year. How do health economists actually calculate the mathematical quality of a year of human life?
It's a complex and often controversial metric, but it is necessary for allocating limited resources. A QALY attempts to combine both the quantity and the quality of life generated by a healthcare intervention. It operates on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 represents death and 1 represents a year of perfect health.
Okay, so what if the person isn't in perfect health?
If an intervention extends a patient's life by 1 year, but they spend that year in severe pain or with significant disability, that year might be weighted at 0.5 QALYs. Conversely, Daly's disability-adjusted life years measure the burden of disease. 1 daily represents the loss of the equivalent of 1 year of full health.
Go ahead.
Epidemiologists use these metrics to compare vastly different interventions. They ask, how much does it cost this screening program to generate 1 additional QLY for the population compared to spending that same money on a vaccination campaign?
And the textbook stresses that when governments initially calculate those costs, they almost invariably underestimate the true financial burden of a screening program. They tend to just look at the unit cost of the biological test itself, The cost of the chemical reagents or the X-ray film?
They often fail to account for the massive hidden costs of public health infrastructure. To screen a national population, you need a colossal IT infrastructure to track millions of addresses, send invitations, record results, and generate recall letters.
That's a huge operation.
Huge. You need rigorous quality assurance overhead teams of experts constantly checking the calibration of the machines and the accuracy of the technicians. You have to train tens of thousands of nurses and radiographers. And crucially, you have to account for the broader economic impact of all those false positives taking days off work due to anxiety to seek extra health checks. The true cost of screening is the cost of managing the entire population, not just the individuals who turn out to be sick.
But perhaps the most difficult aspect of governance isn't starting a screening program. It's what happens once a program is already entrenched in society. This brings us to the popularity paradox, described by Raffel and Gray. This is arguably one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena in all of medicine.
It really is.
The paradox states that the more harm a screening program causes through overdiagnosis and false positives, the more popular that program actually becomes with the general public. Let me make sure I'm following the logic here because it sounds completely backwards.
It does sound backwards until you view it through the lens of human psychology. Imagine a screening program that aggressively overdiagnoses harmless, slow-growing cellular anomalies that the patient's immune system might have cleared naturally, or that would never have grown large enough to cause symptoms in the patient's natural lifetime.
Okay.
The screening program flags these people. They are given a terrifying diagnosis of early-stage disease, they undergo surgery or radiation, and they survive.
And because they survive, they attribute their survival entirely to the fact that the screening program caught it early.
Exactly. You have now created a massive army of citizens who genuinely, passionately believe that this screening program saved their lives. They form fierce, highly organized advocacy groups, they lobby politicians, they tell their deeply moving survival stories to the media.
Wow.
If public health statisticians eventually look at the mortality data and realize, wait, this program hasn't actually lowered the overall death rate in the population, and it is causing thousands of unnecessary, debilitating surgeries, those statisticians are placed in an impossible position.
Because if they try to stop it,
If they suggest shutting the program down, they are viciously attacked by the survivors and the media for trying to take away a life-saving service to save money.
the textbook provides a specific historical anecdote for this. The Japanese neuroblastoma screening program. Let's explore that timeline because it perfectly illustrates the sheer difficulty of reversing public health momentum. Neuroblastoma is a type of cancer that forms in certain types of nerve tissue, most often affecting infants and young children. In 1985, Japan initiated a massive national screening program aimed at catching neuroblastoma in infants.
The intention was noble. Neuroblastoma can be devastating. However, by 1990, just 5 years into the program, an independent international panel reviewed the epidemiological data and raised a massive red flag.
What did they find?
They realized the screening program was not actually reducing neuroblastoma mortality rates. What it was doing was detecting a huge number of neuroblastomas that were destined to spontaneously regress, meaning the infant's body would have healed itself without intervention.
So the screening program was taking perfectly healthy infants who happened to have a transient, self-resolving cell cluster, diagnosing them with cancer and subjecting them to major surgery and chemotherapy.
Yes.
The program was causing undeniable, severe net harm to children.
The data was clear, but the popularity paradox was fully entrenched. The parents of the children who survived the unnecessary treatments believed the screening had saved their babies. The commercial laboratories running the tests had a financial interest in continuing them. The clinicians who had built their careers around the program defended it.
That's a perfect storm.
Because of this deeply emotional momentum, it took years of exhaustive data collection and the formation of a dedicated, high-level national committee before the Japanese government finally managed to shut the program down in 2004.
It took nearly 2 decades to stop a program that early evidence showed was harming infants. That's a chilling reminder of why screening governance must remain completely independent from both commercial interests and well-meaning but statistically misguided public advocacy. This leads us into a tour of how screening plays out across the human lifespan, focusing on the key clinical takeaways the textbook highlights. Starting at the very beginning, antenatal and newborn screening. We routinely screen newborns for conditions like sickle cell disease and cystic fibrosis. This is generally considered highly effective for early intervention, but it uncovers immense operational and ethical complexities regarding data.
Yes, it does.
For example, a genetic test designed to find the disease will often inadvertently uncover carrier status, meaning the child carries one copy of the gene but will not develop the disease.
This creates a profound communication challenge for the healthcare system. The system went looking for a sick patient, but instead it found healthy data that has reproductive implications for that child 20 years in the future.
Right.
Furthermore, in the process of screening the parents and the child for these recessive genetic conditions, the laboratory data will occasionally reveal non-paternity, mathematically proving that the assumed father is not the biological father.
Which places the public health system in a bizarre position. It initiated a test for a blood disorder and ended up holding explosive family secrets. The protocols for how genetic counselors handle that data, what they disclose, to whom and how, require immense care, demonstrating that a biological test is never just a biological event, it's a social intervention.
Very well put.
Moving into adulthood, the controversies surrounding cancer screening deepened significantly, largely due to two critical epidemiological biases that every listener needs to deeply understand: lead time bias and length time bias. Let's break these down carefully.
Let's start with lead time bias. This bias is the reason why looking at survival time after diagnosis is a terrible way to judge if a screening program actually works. Let's walk through a hypothetical scenario.
Right.
Imagine two patients, patient A and patient B. They both develop the initial cellular mutations of a lethal lung cancer at exactly age 50. And sadly, due to the specific biology of their tumors, both are destined to die from this cancer at exactly age 60, regardless of any medical intervention currently available.
Okay, so the biological timeline is fixed. The stopwatch starts at 50 and it ends at 60.
Correct. Now, patient A lives in a country with no screening program. The tumor grows silently for years. Finally, at age 58, patient A develops a persistent cough, goes to the doctor, and gets diagnosed. 2 years later, at age 60, patient A dies.
Tragic.
Yes. The official medical record shows a survival time from diagnosis of 2 years. Now look at patient B, who lives in a country with an aggressive screening program. Patient B gets a routine scan at age 52. The tiny tumor is discovered. Patient B undergoes various treatments, but because the biology is intractable, patient B still dies at age 60.
Okay.
The medical record for patient B shows a survival time from diagnosis of 8 years.
So if a politician or a well-meaning charity looks at the raw statistics, they will say, look, in the unscreened group, people only survive 2 years. But in the screened group, they survive 8 years. The screening program extended their lives by 6 years.
Exactly.
But in reality, it didn't extend patient B's life by a single day.
It just extended the amount of time patient B lived knowing they had a terminal illness. The early diagnosis simply shifted the starting line of the stopwatch backward without moving the finish line. That is lead time bias. It creates the powerful illusion of success, which is why true public health efficacy must be measured by a reduction in population mortality rates, not just survival time after diagnosis.
That's a crucial distinction. Now, what about length time bias? This one seems to be about the nature of the disease itself.
Yes. Length time bias relates to the heterogeneous behavior of tumors. Cancers are not uniform. To use a classic epidemiological analogy, some tumors are like aggressive birds. They grow incredibly fast, spread rapidly, and strike suddenly. Other tumors are like slow-moving turtles. They grow so slowly that they might never metastasize and cause harm within a person's natural lifespan.
Okay, birds and turtles.
If a health service conducts population screening every 3 years, they are mathematically far more likely to catch the slow-moving turtles. Why? Because a turtle tumor remains in the detectable pre-symptomatic phase for a very long time, essentially waiting around to be found by the next routine scan.
And the birds.
The aggressive bird tumors grow so fast that they often develop and become symptomatic in the gaps between the 3-year screening rounds. In clinical terms, these are called interval cancers.
So if I'm a researcher looking at the people who were successfully diagnosed by the screening program, I'm overwhelmingly looking at a group of people who have the slow-moving turtle tumors.
Precisely. And because they have slow-moving, biologically less aggressive tumors, they're going to survive a long time. The screening program will look incredibly successful, but they aren't surviving a long time because the screening program saved them. They are surviving because the screening program disproportionately catches the benign, slow-growing tumors while entirely missing the aggressive ones that actually kill people.
And these two biases, lead time and length time, are at the absolute heart of the massive ongoing controversies surrounding prostate and breast cancer screening today. For prostate cancer, the widespread use of the PSA test, which measures prostate-specific antigen in the blood, has triggered a fierce global debate about overtreatment.
Very fierce.
The textbook notes neutrally that while prostate cancer is very common, the biological reality is that many more men die with prostate cancer than of it.
The clinical dilemma is profound. If a screening program finds a small, slow-growing prostate tumor in an 80-year-old man, the medical instinct is to treat it. But subjecting him to a radical prostatectomy or heavy radiation might cause severe, immediate harms, such as incontinence and impotence, without actually extending his life, because the tumor was never going to be the thing that killed him.
Similarly, with breast cancer, the text highlights the history of the Swedish two-county Taven trials from the 1980s. Those trials were foundational. They originally established the mortality benefits of mammography under strict, randomized research conditions.
Yes, they did.
However, translating a controlled trial into a massive, ongoing national program changes the variables. The modern reality of breast cancer screening involves an ongoing, deeply complex evaluation of the harms of false positives, the psychological trauma of recalls, and the tangible side effects of unnecessary biopsies for microcalcifications that may never have progressed to invasive cancer.
It remains a highly emotive and politically sensitive area of public health. As the textbook wisely notes, it would be a daring, perhaps foolhardy policymaker who would suggest a popular national screening scheme should simply cease, even if independent, evidence-based reviews begin to question its net benefit at a population level.
The social momentum is simply too strong.
Too strong.
Which brings us to a profound philosophical pivot. We've spent a good deal of time dissecting screening, which essentially operates on the assumption that disease is an individual property. We scan the individual's body, we analyze the individual's blood, we track their test results, and we manage their personal anxiety. If the population is a river, screening is standing on the bank, watching the water, and trying to pull the drowning people out one by one as quickly as possible. But public health isn't just about pulling people out of the river, it's about walking upstream to see who is pushing them in.
That's a great way to put it.
So what does this all mean? Screening looks at the individual fish to see if it's sick. But what if the problem is the water? This perfectly sets up the shift from individual-level interventions to macro-level analysis. This brings us to the second half of our deep dive. Ecological and multilevel studies, drawn from Chapter 5.2.
If screening is the ultimate individual-level intervention, ecological studies require us to completely shift our paradigm. We have to understand that the environment, the policy, the neighborhood, the context itself acts as an exposure.
Context as exposure.
What's fascinating here is that it requires us to stop looking exclusively at individual behaviors, what someone eats, whether they smoke, what their genetic risk is, and start looking at the institutions, the environments, and the societies they inhabit. In an ecological study, the fundamental unit of analysis is no longer the individual person, it is the group.
You analyze aggregated data.
Exactly. You are comparing disease rates between entire cities, between nations, or across different historical time periods.
And while this sounds like a modern data-driven concept, public health actually has deep historical roots in this methodology. Back in 1842, long before we understood germ theory, Edwin Chadwick used an ecological approach to compare mortality rates between different towns in Great Britain.
Yes.
He specifically looked at the death rates in drained towns versus undrained towns. He found that Bungay, which was undrained and suffered from poor sanitation, had a significantly higher death rate than Beccles, which was drained.
What's fascinating about Chadwick is that his underlying biological theory was completely wrong. He believed in the miasma theory of disease, the idea that bad, smelly air caused illness.
But his data was right.
Yes. His ecological observation comparing the aggregate mortality of a town against the aggregate infrastructure of a town was entirely correct. He proved that the physical environment dictated the health of the group, leading to nationwide sanitation reforms that saved countless lives.
And of course, there's the legendary work of John Snow during the 1849 London cholera epidemic. Snow didn't stop cholera by testing individual Londoners for a microscopic bacteria. He looked at where they were getting their water. He mapped out the cholera death rates across different districts of London, and he analyzed them based on which water company supplied each district.
It was a brilliant natural experiment. He found that districts supplied by the Southwark and Vauxhall Company, which drew its water from a heavily polluted downstream section of the Thames River, had massively higher cholera mortality rates than districts supplied by the Lambeth Company, which drew its water from further upstream. Again, Snow didn't know the individual behaviors of the victims. His unit of analysis was the geographic district, and the exposure was the structural water source for that district.
To really understand how modern epidemiologists conduct these ecological studies, we have to define the mechanics of how they measure a group. The textbook breaks this down into two specific types of variables. First, we have derived variables, which are sometimes called aggregate variables. These are essentially the mathematical averages or summaries of the individuals living within the group.
For example, if you want to study a neighborhood, you might look at the mean neighborhood income, the percentage of households living below the poverty line, or the percentage of adults who smoke. The variable only exists as a summary of the individual traits of the residents.
But the second type is the integral variable, also known as a primary or global variable. These are fundamentally different. These are properties that only exist at the group level. They have absolutely no equivalent at the individual level.
Precisely. An individual person cannot have a national law banning indoor smoking. An individual person does not have a population density, a political system, or an urban zoning ordinance.
They just live within them.
Right. Those are properties of the context itself. And this is where the ecological framework becomes highly analytical. There is a special subset of derived variables that is absolutely crucial to public health: the prevalence of the dependent variable itself within a group.
Let me make sure I'm following the logic here. Are you saying that the prevalence of a disease or an outcome in my surrounding community physically alters my own personal biological risk of developing that same outcome?
Yes, and the classic example is infectious disease and herd immunity. If 95% of your surrounding community is vaccinated and immune to measles, your individual personal risk of catching measles is dramatically lowered, even if you yourself are completely unvaccinated and non-immune. The context of the group physically protects the individual.
I see.
But what is truly profound is that this dynamic applies to non-infectious conditions as well, such as obesity.
That seems counterintuitive. If I have specific genetic makeup and I eat a specific diet, how does the fact that my neighbor is obese biologically alter my own personal risk of weight gain?
It alters your risk because a high prevalence of a condition in a community structurally changes the environment of that community. If obesity is highly prevalent, it creates obesity norms.
Okay.
It changes the societal, psychological definition of what is considered an acceptable or average body type, which influences individual behavior. But more importantly, the local economic environment adapts to support the prevalent behavior.
So if a community demands fast, highly caloric food, the market responds. Fast food chains move in, fresh produce markets might close due to lack of demand, and the built environment might shift to prioritize drive-thrus and massive parking lots over walkable sidewalks.
Exactly. The group-level prevalence physically changes the structural environment, and then that newly altered environment acts as an integral contextual exposure on you, the individual, making it significantly harder for you to find healthy food or safely walk to work. The context drives the individual risk.
If the context matters this much, and if ecological studies are this powerful, why do they have such a controversial reputation in modern epidemiology?
Oh, well.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Time to talk about the famous ecological fallacy. In its simplest terms, the ecological fallacy is the logical error of inferring individual-level risk based purely on group-level data. It's the trap of assuming that because an association exists between two variables at the group level, that exact same association must exist at the individual level.
It is a massive statistical hazard, but it is vital that we break down exactly why this fallacy occurs. It isn't just a mysterious trick of the data. It is based on mathematics and structural logic. The textbook uses a brilliant, detailed hypothetical example looking at the relationship between income and body mass index, or BMI.
Let's walk through this scenario meticulously. Imagine an epidemiologist looks at aggregate data across multiple different countries. At the group level, they map out the national averages. They find a clear positive correlation. Countries with a higher mean national income have a higher mean BMI. So wealthy nations are generally heavier nations.
Okay.
The epidemiologist falls into the trap and concludes, therefore, at the individual level, earning a higher paycheck causes a person to become heavier.
But then a second researcher decides to look at the individual data inside those specific countries, and they find the exact opposite pattern. Within any given country, the wealthiest individuals actually have the lowest BMIs, and the poorest individuals have the highest BMIs. The group-level association is completely reversed when you look at the individuals.
So if the country is rich, but the wealthy individuals inside are thin, and the poor individuals inside are heavy, the initial assumption was completely wrong. Why does this happen? What are the mechanical reasons that the group data lies to us?
The textbook identifies three distinct structural reasons. First, unmeasured confounders. The group's mean income might be strongly correlated with hidden structural traits that all individuals in that group share, regardless of their personal wealth. For instance, wealthier countries might have economies that rely heavily on the mass production of highly processed, calorically dense foods, and their occupational structures might be heavily weighted towards sedentary office work rather than manual labor.
So if the researcher only measures the country's income, they are missing the fact that the entire country is sitting at desks eating processed food. The effect of the diet and the sedentary lifestyle gets mathematically hidden inside the group's income variable, distorting the picture.
Precisely. That brings us to the second reason. Different constructs. This is perhaps the most vital concept in this chapter. An aggregate variable often measures an entirely different concept than its namesake at the individual level. Individual level income and country level income are not the same thing. They measure different forces.
How so? A dollar is a dollar, isn't it?
Not structurally. A poor person living in a wealthy country has a fundamentally different risk profile than a poor person living in a poor country. The rich country's high mean income exerts what we call a contextual effect.
A textual effect.
Right. The wealth of the nation means the nation has the infrastructure to mass produce an abundance of cheap, highly caloric processed food. Therefore, living in that rich country places everyone, especially the poorest individuals who rely on the cheapest food available, at a higher risk of elevated BMI. You cannot use the country's mean income as a proxy for the individual's wallet.
That makes perfect sense. The environment of wealth creates a risk that affects everyone inside it differently. And what is the third reason the ecological fallacy occurs?
Grouping by the dependent variable. This occurs when structural sorting mechanisms actively push people into specific geographic groups based on the very outcome you are trying to study. Think of economic residential segregation in a major city. People are structurally forced into specific neighborhoods based on their income and racial demographic.
Right.
If a researcher tries to study the relationship between race, income, and health outcomes using only neighborhood-level averages, the historical and economic process of how those neighborhoods were segregated in the first place will deeply bias the group-level regression coefficient. The groups aren't random. They are the result of systemic forces.
The ecological fallacy is clearly a massive danger for researchers analyzing macro data. But the textbook points out that the ecological fallacy is not alone. It has equally dangerous twins at the other levels of analysis. If the ecological fallacy is the error of applying group data to individuals, what is the atomistic fallacy?
The atomistic fallacy is the exact reverse. It is the error of inferring group-level dynamics based purely on individual-level data.
Give me an example.
Well, a psychologist might study individual stress levels and find they correlate with heart disease. But if they try to use that individual data to explain why the overall heart disease rate varies so wildly between the United States and Japan, they will fail. The defining variable between those two countries might not be the average individual stress level, but rather a massive systemic difference, like agricultural food subsidies, urban transportation infrastructure, or national healthcare access. You cannot explain the forest simply by measuring the bark on the trees.
And then we have two more nuanced, highly contextual fallacies, the psychologistic fallacy and the sociologistic fallacy. Let's look at the psychologistic fallacy first. This occurs when you study individuals and you completely ignore the context they live in, assuming everything about their health is driven purely by their internal psychology or biology. The text uses a compelling example regarding immigrants and depression.
Yes. Imagine a purely individual-level study is conducted, and it finds that immigrants have a significantly higher rate of clinical depression than native-born citizens. A researcher commits the psychologistic fallacy if they conclude that this elevated depression rate is purely due to the internal psychological trauma of the immigration process itself, or perhaps some underlying genetic vulnerability.
What are they missing by focusing only on the individual's psyche?
They are completely ignoring the group context. What if further analysis reveals that the depression rate is only elevated for immigrants who are living in highly isolated, segregated neighborhoods where they are a tiny demographic minority facing severe daily discrimination?
Ah.
For immigrants living in diverse, culturally supportive neighborhoods, their depression rates might be lower than the native population. By ignoring the neighborhood context, the researcher falsely attributes the cause entirely to the individual's mind rather than the hostile environment.
And the mirror image of that is the sociologistic fallacy. This happens when you study a group context but completely ignore the relevant traits of the individuals moving through that context.
Exactly.
Say a sociologist studies a city and finds that transient communities' neighborhoods with a high turnover of people moving in and out have unusually high rates of schizophrenia. The sociologist concludes that transient communities cause severe social disorganization, which creates immense stress for everyone living there, thereby causing schizophrenia across the whole neighborhood.
But they committed the sociologistic fallacy because if they had looked closer at the individual data, they would have seen that the schizophrenia rate isn't high among the long-term residents of that neighborhood. It is only high among the transient individuals themselves.
Why is that?
This is often explained by the drift hypothesis. People suffering from severe, untreated mental illness often struggle to maintain permanent employment and housing, causing them to drift into transient, low-income neighborhoods. The chaotic context of the neighborhood didn't cause the schizophrenia. The illness caused the individuals to move into the neighborhood. The researchers simply ignored the individual traits.
So, historically, epidemiology found itself stuck between a rock and a hard place. If you only study massive groups and national averages, you fall into the ecological fallacy. But if you only study individuals in clinical isolation, you fall into the atomistic or psychologistic fallacies. How does modern public health mathematically fix this?
The modern advanced solution is called multilevel modeling.
I love the visual analogy for this. Think of multi-level modeling like a set of Russian nesting dolls. You have an individual person, but that person is nested inside a family unit. That family is nested inside a neighborhood. That neighborhood is nested inside a specific city, which is nested inside a state, which is nested inside a country.
Exactly. Multilevel modeling is a highly advanced statistical approach that doesn't force researchers to choose between the individual and the group. Instead, it utilizes a two-stage system of equations to simultaneously analyze the data at multiple levels at once.
I hope that does both.
Conceptually, what this mathematics allows researchers to do is to finally rigorously disentangle composition from context. These are two vital terms. Composition refers to the personal characteristics of the people living in a specific neighborhood, their personal income, their age, their individual diet, their genetic history.
So composition is who lives there.
Correct. Context, on the other hand, refers to the structural environment itself, the neighborhood's overall poverty level, its access to fresh grocery stores, its violent crime rate, its air pollution levels.
So using the statistical power of the Russian nesting dolls, researchers can look at a spike in cardiovascular disease in a specific zip code and finally answer the ultimate public health question. Are these people sick simply because of who they are individually, their composition, or are they sick because of the structural reality of where they live, the context?
Precisely. And what multi-level modeling has proven time and time again is that structural conditions, civic policies, and social determinants are rigorous, mathematically measurable exposures.
It's a massive shift.
This methodology has forced a massive paradigm shift in public health. It moves the discipline away from purely blaming individuals for poor health choices and provides hard, statistical evidence that the built environment and the social structure dictate health outcomes just as powerfully and sometimes more powerfully than individual genetics or personal behavior.
And that brings us to our synthesis and systems impact. Let's connect everything we've unpacked today back to you, the listener. Whether you are a junior doctor sitting in a busy outpatient clinic trying to explain a false positive test result to a terrified patient, or a public health trainee looking at massive spreadsheets of census data, why does understanding the paradoxes of mass screening on one hand and the mathematics of multi-level models on the other actually matter to your daily practice?
This raises an important question. It matters because it forces us to confront the fundamental philosophy of resource allocation in medicine. If a society relies solely on mass screening, we are treating public health entirely as an individual-level problem.
We're just scanning the fish.
We are spending billions of dollars and risking immense psychological harm through false positives and overdiagnosis to scan millions of people to catch diseases one by one. But if our ecological and multi-level studies reveal that the primary drivers of these specific diseases are actually integral group variables, like a national agricultural policy that subsidizes high fructose corn syrup, or urban zoning designs that make walking impossible, or severe systemic income inequality, then mass individual screening is just a massively expensive downstream band-aid.
A Band-Aid.
True, transformative public health requires measuring and intervening on the context itself. We cannot just wait for the individuals to get sick and hope our early warning radar catches them in time.
It's the difference between standing at the bottom of the river, frantically pulling drowning people out one by one, and finally making the decision to walk miles upstream to see who or what system is pushing them in.
Well said.
All right, it's time to lock this conceptual knowledge in. We have 6 rapid, single best answer prompts based on today's deep dive. I'm going to read the question, pause for a moment so you can test your recall, and then reveal the answer in the specific chapter reference so you know exactly where to review the material in the text. Let's go.
Ready?
Question 1. Which epidemiological screening bias occurs when an early diagnosis appears to massively increase a patient's survival time, even if the actual biological time of their death remains completely unchanged by the intervention?
Think of the stopwatch analogy.
Answer. Lead time bias. You can review this concept in Chapter 11.4 under the section Screening in Adults. Question 2. Imagine you are implementing a screening program in a healthy population where the disease prevalence is exceptionally low. In order to prevent a massive flood of false positive results from overwhelming your clinics, which test property is mathematically most vital to maximize?
You must prioritize identifying the true negatives.
Answer. Specificity. Review Chapter 11.4, Properties of Screening Tests. Question 3. A researcher publishes a paper inferring that individual-level personal income directly affects a person's diet, based solely on analyzing aggregated data that compares national median incomes against national mortality rates. This logical error is a classic example of what?
You cannot apply group-level correlations directly to individuals.
Answer. The ecological fallacy. Review Chapter 5.2, The Ecological Fallacy. Question 4. When designing an ecological study, what specific type of group-level variable is a national law banning indoor smoking or a city's specific population density?
It has no individual equivalent.
Answer. An integral variable, which is sometimes also called a primary or global variable. Review Chapter 5.2, Group-Level Variables. Question 5. Which advanced methodological and statistical approach utilizes a system of equations to simultaneously separate the effects of a neighborhood's structural environment, the context, from the personal characteristics of the people living there, the composition?
Think of the Russian nesting dolls.
Answer. Multilevel modeling. Review Chapter 5.2, Studies with both groups and individuals. Question 6. What psychological and political phenomenon explains why it is often incredibly difficult for a government to stop an established screening program, even when independent epidemiological evidence definitively proves it is causing net harm through overdiagnosis?
People form intense attachments to these programs.
Answer. The popularity paradox. Review Chapter 11.4, Evaluating, Restricting, and Stopping Existing Programs. Before we go, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, building on the concepts of ecological data we discussed today. We've talked extensively about traditional ecological studies using zip codes, census data, and national borders. But think about the technological era we are entering right now.
It's changing rapidly.
With the ubiquity of smartphones and wearable health tech, our devices are constantly silently aggregating our social networks, our geographic movement, our heart rates, and our physical activity in real time. Are we inadvertently participating in a continuous, global, artificially intelligent ecological study?
That's a huge question.
And if so, as these proprietary algorithms group us, categorize us, and analyze us, how will public health in the future separate a patient's true biological risk from the algorithmic, digital context they have been placed in? It's a structural question we're going to have to answer very soon. Something for you to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the context. Here are the details of this episode.
Ecological and multi-level studies. Byline. When context becomes the exposure, understanding health beyond the individual,